So I'd like to start this class session out with a little bit of a thought experiment perhaps, a hypothetical scenario. I just want to kind of get everybody's intuitions set on this. So in this scenario, let's say that you ask me how my weekend was, and I say, oh man, my weekend was absolutely amazing. I've got to tell you about this thing that I did this weekend. It blew me away. Here's what happened this weekend. I was with a friend, and I was just kind of hanging out with him, saying I was bored. I didn't really know what to do. And my friend said, come with me. I've got this thing. It's just going to blow you away. Like, your life will never be the same after this. So he takes me to his friend's house, and we go into the guy's backyard, where he goes behind the shed, and he pulls out a big burlap sack. And he opens up the big burlap sack to reveal a whole bunch of kittens. Just dozens of kittens inside the sack. Just kind of like meow, meow, meow. Just being adorable little kittens. And I think to myself, like, this is cool. There's a whole big sack full of kittens. All right, the day's getting better. I had no idea just how amazing it was going to become. Because the next thing that happens is, dude takes the whole sack of kittens and he dumps them all out on his patio. He's got like one of those concrete patios in his backyard. Dumps out all the kittens on the patio and just starts going to town. He's stomping everywhere, all over this patio. He's stomping on the kittens, and every time he stomps, he manages to get a kitten head right underneath his foot, and he's just obliterating these kittens, stomping their heads into just a fine pink paste. And the sound that it made, I can't even describe it. The sound is... It was beautiful. It was this it's like somewhere halfway between like a squish and a pop. It was just the most beautiful sound that I had ever heard. Now, I know what you must be thinking. You're listening to me tell the story and you're thinking to yourself, like, this guy is totally crazy. Stomping on kitten heads? Look, I wasn't the one stomping on the kitten heads, and I'll be one of the first to admit that it is totally unfortunate that the kittens have to die in order to make this sound. In fact, I find it so unpleasant that I would never stomp on the kittens myself. But I will totally, and I totally did, pay this guy to stomp on the kitten heads for me, and I just kind of sat there and I listened. I listened to the beautiful sounds that it made, that thing. And I, as disgusted as I was by like all of the dead kittens that are lying around afterwards, I had the craving. I had this hunger. I couldn't stop wanting to hear more kitten heads getting stomped. So I went and I talked to a friend of mine who's a musician and specializes in electronic music and kind of crafts all these sounds from synthesizers. And I asked him to make an artificial sound of kitten heads getting stomped for me. And he tried out all sorts of things. He was asking me what it sounded like. I was trying to explain it. I was like halfway between a squish and a pop. And he made some sounds, and they sounded okay, but like it really wasn't even close to the same. He even went over to dude's house with a microphone and sampled the sounds of actual kitten heads getting stomped, and then kind of cleaned it up in his computer afterwards and played the recordings for me, so that I could listen to it over and over and over again without any new kittens having to die. But I gotta be honest, even that, it was close, it was better, but it wasn't really exactly the same. So I'm left now in this scenario where I'm wondering, like, I really enjoyed it. I really liked stomping on the kitten heads. Maybe I might even go so far as to say that I could make a tradition out of it. Or maybe, like, I might tell you that, like, this is something that my family has done for generations. It's a tradition that we've all engaged in, stomping on kitten heads. What, you don't stomp on kitten heads? It's a fun thing to do. It sounds wonderful. Am I just like a monster for this? You may be wondering, hopefully you're not wondering, like, is this guy serious? Hopefully it's obvious that I'm just making this up. I would never stomp on kitten heads. I would never ask somebody else to stomp on kitten heads for me just so I could listen to it. Even if I said that, like, well, I don't actually do the stomping myself, I get somebody else to do it just so that I can listen. I'd prefer that the kittens didn't have to die, but I really, really like the sound, so, like, what am I going to do? The artificial way that I don't like as much? Nah, I gotta have real kitten heads getting stomped. My sense is that nobody would look at this sort of explanation, any of the possible justifications that I could give, like that I really enjoy it, that the sound is incredibly beautiful, even if I said something like it's a tradition that's been in my family for generations, my sense is that very few people would hear a scenario like that and think to themselves, yeah, that's fine. Let the guy do it if he wants. If he wants to stomp on kitten heads because he enjoys it, then I guess he should just go ahead and stomp on kitten heads. My sense is that almost all of us would object to this and would say anybody who stomps on kitten heads for fun, something has gone wrong with them. We might even go so far as to say we think that something is wrong with somebody if they enjoy the sound of kitten heads getting stomped. And even if they did enjoy it, even if we decided there wasn't anything wrong with enjoying that like we have no control over the things that we like, we just like what we like, my sense is that most of us would say that the mere fact that we find it pleasant isn't enough to tell us that it's okay for us to do it. That even if lots of people really love the sound of kitten heads getting stomped, we still would think that it's not okay to stomp on kitten heads. So if this scenario that I'm describing sounds like one that sounds clearly morally objectionable, the sort of thing where if you were in class and the person next to you kind of raised their hand and said, like, I don't see what the problem with this is, I think that this would be okay, you would actually be a little bit suspicious of this person. My sense is that you should also object to eating a cheeseburger. My sense is that anybody who thinks that it's wrong to stomp on kitten heads just because they like the way that it sounds should also be saying that it's wrong to eat a cheeseburger just because we like the way that it tastes. And the similarities between these two cases are ones that I think that when we get down to brass tacks, when we figure out what's actually relevant to this question of whether or not we should be allowed to do this, these two scenarios are pretty much the same. There are no real relevant differences between them. Some folks might think to themselves, I don't have to hear beautiful sounds in order to survive, but I do have to eat in order to survive. To which I would respond, well, clearly you don't have to eat a cheeseburger in order to survive. It's entirely possible to have a healthy diet where you don't kill any animals in order to get the food that you eat. So if it's not necessary for survival, if it's not necessary for good nutrition, then why do we eat meat? My sense is that it comes down to two factors. One is we like the taste, and the second one is it's just a tradition. It's just the sort of thing that we're accustomed to doing culturally. But neither of those are really good reasons for why we should be allowed to kill animals. If we're wondering whether it's okay to kill an animal because it tastes good, we should recognize that sounds nice in my ears, that I like the sound of the kitten heads getting stomped, is really not all that different than tastes good in my mouth. Both of them are saying that some sensuous pleasure that I get from this experience is enough to counterbalance the death of the animal life that has to happen in order for that event to happen. If we just point out that it's a tradition, then we would reflect on would we feel any different about the kitten head stomping if somebody claimed that it was a tradition in their family? And my sense is we probably wouldn't think that that was any kind of morally exculpatory reason that could be given. In addition to this, we might point out that we personally tend not to kill the animals that we eat. We ask somebody else to do it because we find it a little bit distasteful, and we can point to the kitten head stomping and say that the same sort of thing is going on there. Despite the fact that I'm not the one actually doing the stomping, it still seems like I'm morally culpable if I pay the person to do the stomping for me. And the same thing should apply in the case of the cheeseburger as well. This is an argument that I'm setting up. And it's a very specific sort of argument. It has a very specific sort of structure that we're going to be discussing in this class session. We're also going to be discussing this particular question of whether or not it's okay to eat a cheeseburger in the normal sorts of circumstances that most Americans find themselves in. So we're going to exclude circumstances where we would say something like, if your life was on the line, if you were starving to death and the only way to survive would be to eat this cheeseburger, then we'd say that, okay, go right ahead, eat the cheeseburger. If it's you or the cow, just like if it's you versus the sack of kittens, right? If it was your life on the line or the sack of kittens' life is on the line and you have to choose one, I'll go ahead and presume that, yeah, sure, that's maybe a good enough reason to kill the kittens to save your own life. But that's not the normal case when it comes to eating cheeseburgers, and it's not the sort of case that I described when I was talking about stomping on the kitten heads. There are all kinds of other sorts of objections that folks might bring up. I look forward to hearing all of those. On Friday is when this is going to kind of come to some sort of close, and you'll have an argument analysis assignment to do about this question of whether it's okay to eat a cheeseburger. I'll be setting that up through discussion board and through the argument analysis assignment that's going to be posted later this week. For now, though, let's just look at exactly what it is that makes this argument that I've made tick. If there is anything compelling going on in it, why is there something compelling? If we have this sense that maybe there's something wrong with the argument, that there's like some wiggle room in there where we can make some counter arguments, what would those counter arguments look like? And basically what this comes down to is that this argument that I just made is an inductive argument. It is an inductive argument because the sort of conclusion that we come to is an inference that is likely at best. We're moving from premises to conclusion in a way where it's not airtight. We don't have that kind of that structure of validity where if the premises are true, the conclusion would have to be true. Instead, we just kind of, we almost get there. Or we get to a point where we get this sense that the conclusion is probably true on the basis of the premises. Really what this comes down to is this recognition that inductive arguments, even though they're not deductive, even though they never get to this structure of validity, this doesn't mean that they're not good arguments. We can have perfectly good inductive arguments. As a matter of fact, I'd go so far as to say that we need to make inductive arguments. If we're waiting around for absolute certainty in order to believe something, if we're going to say that I'm never going to believe anything for any reasons that don't get me to the point where like I can beyond a shadow of a doubt say that this is definitely true, then I'm just not going to believe very many things. In order to get around in the world, in order to not get hit by buses, expect that the sun's going to come up the next day. Expect that your friend's going to pick you up from the airport when they said they were. We've got to recognize that likely is good enough to count as rational in a lot of contexts. Another thing that's probably worth pointing out about these inductive arguments is that they're what some folks refer to as ampliative forms of reasoning. Compare this to deduction, and we're going to get a much clearer sense of this in the second half of the semester when we dig into deduction a little more. But with deduction, when we have a valid argument, what we're usually looking at is a scenario where once I've got all of my premises, I've already got my conclusion. It's just a matter of unpacking the conclusion out of the premises. What I get with inductive arguments, on the other hand, is something a little bit different. I get some premises, I get some like body of evidence, I get some set of reasons that give me like this expectation, but the conclusion that I'm drawing reaches beyond what the reasons support beyond any kind of shadow of a doubt. I'm kind of expanding my knowledge. By the time I'm done with an inductive argument, I haven't just reworded what I know different things than I knew before, right? I know more than I knew before. The strength of any sort of inductive ampliative inference, any kind of inductive argument, is going to hinge on, and every single inductive argument is going to be like this, the recognition of some kind of pattern, and the articulation of that pattern as somehow reliable. So reliable, in fact, that once I've observed that pattern at work in a certain sort of context, I'm willing to take the gamble that I think that that pattern expands beyond that context and covers new cases that I haven't seen before. That's that ampliative move that induction accomplishes. It recognizes that there's some pattern going on in the evidence, and then it says, we believe that this pattern extends beyond where we've already looked. And now we can start drawing conclusions that go beyond what our evidence says, right? That are ampliative, that grow our knowledge. And the trick to evaluating these inductive inferences really lies in evaluating the reliability of this pattern, how relevant that pattern is to the conclusion that we're drawing, and this question about whether or not we've got enough likelihood, whether or not the conclusion is probable enough to justify our taking a chance on believing it. So this raises this brand new question, which is, with any kind of inductive inference, with any kind of an inference where I'm talking about a conclusion that is likely so long as the conclusions are true, so long as the premises are true, how likely would be likely enough to warrant my believing something? How cautious should I be when I'm engaging in induction? How credulous should I be? And the answer to this question is, well, it depends. Sometimes it makes sense to be bolder, sometimes it makes sense to be more cautious. One of the things that we want to think about is this question of what's at stake. So for example, I think we've got a slide here that says something like, is it reasonable to bet $10 on a single die roll? This question of whether if I roll a 6, I'll win, versus if I roll anything but a 6, I'll lose. Or maybe we'll even reverse it. Let's say if I roll a 6, I lose, and if I roll anything but a 6, I'll win. Yeah, in fact, let's think of it like this. As a matter of fact, let's think of it in a completely different way. let's suppose that I give you a deal where I say, I've been planning on having this first exam coming up here, but let's make it interesting. Let's say I pull a fair die out of my pocket. It's not loaded or weighted funny or anything like that. And I say, I'm going to give this a roll. If it turns up a 6, how about if it turns up a 6, we'll do exam 1 just like I had planned. I'll post it today. You'll have until midnight on Friday to do it. It'll be timed. It'll be 2 hours. It'll be 30 questions, give or take, and you'll only get 1 attempt on it. And however you score when you take the quiz, that'll be the score that you get for exam 1. That's what happens if I roll a 6. If I roll anything besides a 6, if I roll 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, let's say I just give everybody 100 on this exam, regardless of how well they perform on it, regardless of whether or not they even attempt it. I'll just give everybody a 100. Does that seem like a deal that most of you would be interested in taking? And my sense is almost everybody would say, like, yeah, sign me up. That's a great deal. I've only got a 1 in 6 chance of losing this game. I've got a 5 in 6 chance of winning this game. I'd have to be a fool not to take those odds. Well, if it's the odds that seem compelling here, if it's the fact that you have a 1 in 6 chance of losing but a 5 in 6 chance of winning, perhaps we might consider whether or not we're equally compelled to play a game of Russian roulette, which also has a 1 in 6 chance of losing and a 5 in 6 chance of winning. And my sense is most people would look at that scenario and say, like, no way, that makes no sense. Of course I don't want to play Russian roulette. But why is it that scenario, when I say if I roll a 6, then we'll take the exam as planned, if I roll anything but a 6, everybody gets 100. Why does that seem so appealing while Russian roulette seems so just crazy, not a rational sort of a game to play? And the answer, hopefully, is pretty clear and obvious right there on the surface, is that different things are at stake in these two different games. In the first case, where a 6 gets us the exam as we planned and anything but a 6 gets everybody 100, the version of losing this game really ends up looking the same as if I didn't play the game at all. If we don't play the game, exam will go off as planned. If you lose the game, exam goes off as planned. It's the same as not playing. So we might say that you have nothing really to lose in playing this game. And you have something significant to win, namely a free 100 on the exam. Compare that to the Russian roulette game, where you have something very significant to lose. If you lose this game, you die, or at least you sustain a very serious brain injury. And if you win the game, you live? You get pretty much the same thing that you'd get if you didn't play, except with the possibility of a little bit of a thrill. So in the first die game, it seems like there's really nothing to lose and something to win. And on top of that, you've got a better chance of winning than you do of losing. That's a great deal to take. Compare that to Russian roulette, where you have a better chance of winning than losing, but the difference between what there is to lose and what there is to gain when you win and lose is really, really huge. So all this is to say that when we say that it depends on various contexts, whether or not it makes sense to take a chance on a likely inference, one of the things that this depends on is what's on the line. What is there to be gained and lost by taking the chance on believing something that is probably true, versus maybe what it is that's on the line if we suspend judgment, what it is that's on the line if we go with a contrary sort of conclusion. All right, keep that in mind. That's going to be bouncing around every time we look at any inductive inference. That's one of the last questions that we're going to ask is, how bold should we be? How likely is likely enough? And have we kind of gotten to the point where it's worth it to try to take a chance on a conclusion that is probably true? Okay, the first form of inductive arguments that I want to look at and that we're going to be looking at in this class session is the argument by analogy. An argument by analogy basically just compares two different cases, two situations, and says, look, these two situations are similar. They're similar in a sort of reliable way. There's a pattern. Remember, I said this about inductive arguments. They always have some sort of pattern that's demonstrated as somehow reliable enough to expand beyond where we've seen it. Well, an argument by analogy uses that as well. For an argument by analogy, the pattern involved is a pattern of similarity between two cases, where we say, here's case 1, here's case 2. Case 1 has properties A, B, C, D, E, and F. Case 2 has properties A, B, C, D, E, and F. Case 1 has property G as well. What do we think about case 2? Do we think it has property G? Argument by analogy suggests that if there's a pattern of similarity between the two cases, we'll expect that pattern to expand beyond where it's already been noticed and kind of cover other contexts as well. So it seems like that kind of bare bones structure that I laid out for an argument by analogy, we can see how it is that this could be a compelling argument. We could also see how this could be a busted argument, right? Just because case 1 and case 2 share properties A through F, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're also going to share property G. And one of the things that a good argument by analogy is kind of like trading on is this idea that the pattern of similarity between the two cases that's already been established is somehow relevant to or is related to this additional similarity that we're trying to draw a conclusion about. So in the argument that I gave you just earlier about stomping on the kitten heads in the cheeseburger, obviously the two analogs that are being compared are stomping on kitten heads because I like the way that it sounds versus eating a cheeseburger because I like the way that it tastes. And what I was arguing, or like what I was putting forth, the way that I was portraying these two cases, is that they seem to be similar in all of the morally relevant ways, such that if our moral judgment about the kitten head stomping is that it's wrong, because the cheeseburger eating scenario is so similar in all of the relevant ways, we should also think that that's wrong too. There are plenty of other scenarios where we use arguments by analogy. They're one of the most useful forms of induction that we have at our fingertips. If we want to kind of zoom in on some of the examples that are in on the presentation slides, we'll notice that any kind of model organism type science is going to be inherently using some sort of argument by analogy. So, for example, if we have something like noticing that the way that the human body works is remarkably similar to the way that the bodies of laboratory rats work, and we also notice that rats who consume large quantities of artificial sweeteners tend to have abnormally high cancer rates, we might be inclined to conclude, therefore, that it's safe to assume that any human who consumes large quantities of artificial sweeteners also has a very high chance of getting cancer. And what this argument is hinging on is a comparison, right? Is an analogy, a set of similarities between the way that a rat body works and the way that a human body works. And there are differences between rat bodies and human bodies. Rats have tails, humans don't. Rats have more fur than humans do, I guess as a percentage of the surface area of their skin, perhaps. There are all kinds of differences that we can identify between rat bodies and human bodies. The question is, are those differences relevant to the way that cancer happens in a rat body or the way that cancer happens in a human body? Are the similarities between rat bodies and human bodies more relevant to the conclusion that's being drawn, namely this conclusion about whether or not it's safe for humans to consume large quantities of artificial sweeteners? Is that conclusion relevant more to the similarities between these two cases, or is it relevant more to the differences? Let's take a look at, let's look at the third example on that slide. We all know that slavery is morally wrong, but working at a job where you aren't allowed to make any decisions for yourself and where you have to do whatever your boss says seems an awful lot like slavery. Therefore, having to work a job like that is also morally wrong. Again, we're seeing an analogy that's kind of being articulated, right? Some kind of vague gesture towards a set of similarities between being a slave and having to work a job where you're not allowed to make any decisions for yourself and where you have to do whatever your boss says. There are some striking similarities between those two cases, but there also seem like there are some striking dissimilarities as well. And a lot of those dissimilarities seem like they might be ones that are relevant to the moral status of either slavery or working at a job where you don't get to make decisions for yourself. For example, a job where you don't get to make decisions for yourself and where you have to do whatever your boss says is similar to slavery, I suppose, but unlike slavery, you get paid. Or unlike slavery, if you really don't like it, you can just get up and walk away. Now, this is not always as easy as it seems, right? The mere fact that you're being paid doesn't mean that you can be exploited, and just because I can technically walk away, that doesn't mean that I can't be coerced into staying. Say, for example, if walking away means that me and my entire family would starve, right? So, yeah, I'd be a little bit suspicious about those sorts of things, but that difference between slavery and what some folks might call wage slavery, that difference between owning somebody as property and just kind of exposing them to exploitative sorts of employment circumstances, there seems to be enough of a difference between these two, especially this difference about being able to get up and leave if you really don't like it. That's a really big and morally relevant difference between the two cases, such that even if I was going to agree that wage slavery or working at a job where you're not allowed to make any decisions for yourself and where you have to do whatever your boss says, that might actually be morally wrong, but it's not morally wrong the same way that slavery is. And perhaps I might even go so far as to say that they both might not be okay, but one of them is worse than the other. So we can see in that case, that was a really weak analogy. There were important differences between the two analogous cases that really broke down the support that was being offered by the premises for the conclusion. And we compare that to, say, for example, studies that are done on rats that are trying to get some sense of how a substance is going to respond in a human body, and we might get a sense that, yeah, that one is a better argument. It has more support. The pattern of similarity between the two cases is stronger, it seems more reliable, and it seems relevant to the conclusion that's being drawn. So this brings us to maybe a set of questions that we want to ask ourselves every time we're trying to evaluate an argument by analogy. Maybe some things to worry about anytime somebody's making an analogical induction. And the pattern that this is going to follow is going to roughly be the same as the pattern of things that we're concerned about for every single inductive inference. All inductive inferences are based on, as I said before, the articulation of some sort of reliable pattern and the expectation that that pattern is going to extend beyond where we've already seen it. Same sort of things going on with an analogical induction. So the rough structure of the things that we're concerned about is going to be the same for all inductive arguments. There's going to be, one, some kind of quantitative question. Maybe, for example, we might be thinking about the number of similarities or the number of dissimilarities between the two analog cases that are being compared in any argument by analogy. Or there might be more than two cases, right? And as a matter of fact, the number of cases that are being compared. This might be the sort of thing that also says a little something about how good this analogy is, how reliable it is, how strong the argument by analogy is going to be. Because if I have a larger number and maybe a large diversity of cases that I'm comparing, it makes that pattern that's being recognized between all these cases even stronger. For example, if we're looking at the case of talking about rat bodies and their similarity to human bodies, and that this maybe gives us reason to believe that if rats get cancer from large quantities of artificial sweeteners, humans probably will as well. Well, if on top of rats we also found that pigs get cancer when they consume large quantities of artificial sweeteners, and so do dolphins, and so do elephants, and so do chimpanzees, and so do rabbits. If all of those cases show the same thing, now it's starting to look even more likely like humans will also get cancer or are more likely to get cancer if they eat large quantities of artificial sweeteners. So this idea of the number of different cases that are being analyzed in our analogy, that's a thing to be concerned about when trying to determine whether the analogy is a good one. The number of similarities and dissimilarities, that's another quantitative sort of question that gets at this issue of how strong is the pattern that this analogy is latching onto, this pattern of similarity. And it's not just a quantitative question, because it's not just an issue of the number of cases or the number of similarities and dissimilarities. These similarities and dissimilarities need to be relevant in order for them to count, in order for them to say anything about the strength or the weakness of this argument in the way that it supports the conclusion that's being drawn. So it's not just this question of whether or not the two analog cases or more analog cases are very, very similar to one another. We have to ask ourselves whether those similarities are relevant to the conclusion that's being drawn. For example, if I was looking at rats and humans and I said, rats starts with R, but humans starts with H. That's a dissimilarity between the two cases. But it doesn't seem like it's one that's relevant to how it is that rats and humans get cancer, or how it is that they might respond to artificial sweeteners, right? So that's a dissimilarity, but it's not a relevant dissimilarity, so it really doesn't seem like it says anything at all about how strong or weak this argument is. Anytime I get a relevant similarity, that's going to strengthen my argument by analogy. Anytime I get a relevant dissimilarity between my two analog cases, that's going to weaken my argument by analogy. If I give some kind of similarity or dissimilarity between the two cases that's not relevant to the conclusion that's being drawn, then this should have no effect on the strength of my argument by analogy. And then, last but not least, this third question that I want to ask myself, it has nothing to do with the quantity of cases that we're looking at or the quantity of similarities or dissimilarities. That kind of tells me something about how strong this pattern is. It doesn't necessarily tell me this qualitative issue about the relevance of the similarities and dissimilarities to the conclusion that's being drawn. But it's this question that we are asking ourselves about, rolling the dice for the free 100 or playing Russian roulette. It's this question of, do I have an appropriate amount of confidence for the conclusion that's being drawn? What's on the line? We recognize that anytime I make an analogical induction, anytime I'm drawing a conclusion on the basis of an argument by analogy, I'm always going to end up with a conclusion that is only probably true. Even the strongest of arguments by analogy are only going to be probably true. And I need to ask myself, is probably true good enough for what's on the line in drawing this conclusion, in believing what it is that the argument is pointing towards? Okay, so that's arguments by analogy. Like I said, we're going to be opening up a discussion board where we get to discuss this question of whether or not it's okay to eat a cheeseburger. We're going to start out by looking at the argument by analogy that I've laid out, and then we're going to see if we can test it a little bit, see if we can find some interesting counter arguments, and hopefully wrap things up by the end of the week with you guys ready to do your first argument analysis about that topic. Stay tuned for a homework assignment on arguments by analogy. I'm posting some worksheets below this along with the answers to that worksheet that'll give you some tools for doing that homework assignment. And keep your eyes peeled on Wednesday for another class session and another little homework assignment that will be about moral arguments. Until then, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. And yeah, best of luck with everything.